And we're back with Q Willey for round three. Q, I'm stoked to have you back on. For people that may not have listened to the previous two episodes or just aren't familiar with you, can you tell us about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll try to be brief. Q Willey, strength and conditioning coach, performance physical therapist, if you want. I don't know, just physical therapist. Really enjoy working with athletes. Been an athlete for a long time myself. Just been obsessed with all things training and all things rehab. And you and I linked up a long time ago when we were both kind of in school and going through barbell medicine courses and interested in the E3 folks as well. And kind of have been in this network, clinical athlete forums and clinical athlete people that branched out into a lot of our clinician group now, which is wide and diverse across the country and really across the world now. And so, you and I have known each other for a long time and interact in this rehab space. Have been stoked to see you link up with E3. A lot of good content and good stuff that y'all provide. So really appreciate all the great work that you guys do as well.
Yeah, if people want to go to the old school Q conversations, we had a podcast we co-hosted with Mason Moore as well. Shout out Mason. And those were the good old days back in, I think I was still in school and you were a year or two out. Mason was about to graduate. So if people want to go listen to some years ago episodes, type in adaptabilia on whatever platform you use to listen, and you can hear us rambling back then. So it's been
Yeah.
great to see the evolution of both of us and just the consistent friendship and how much you've been able to provide. And I'm stoked for this conversation. So today we're talking all things change of direction. And if people haven't followed you, your Instagram posts are amazing, just showing some practical examples of change of direction progressions. But I think a longer format of a discussion around really how do people implement it, what should they think about, and it is a messy thing for a lot of clinicians and even coaches, but some clinicians may feel comfortable introducing acceleration and linear speed work during a plan of care, and they're getting to this late stage and they know change of direction is extremely valuable and that the sport an athlete has to go back to, it's a big component of most sports, but they don't really know how to implement it, how to progress it. And you've just done such a good job with the way you formatted it and your own experience coaching athletes and patients through it. So let's start kind of broad. Change of direction. Where should clinicians even start? And I'll let you take it from here.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I appreciate that. I think that I've been interacting with change of direction related stuff for pretty long time and pretty intensely, but I would still not consider myself an expert in it by any means. And I think that when, you're in school, they teach you that, oh, the demands of sport are extreme, and there's so much chaos and they have to be prepared to do this. But like how you get there is never really clearly outlined. And to date, I mean, there's very few even performance coaches on the strength and conditioning side of things or sports performance side of things that have created any kind of real framework for this. And so it's just kind of this like complete chaos and wild west. And like even what I put out on Instagram, like if you were actually trying to create some kind of a program, you really couldn't use a lot of what I put out there to just like all of a sudden, oh, I'm just going to do this exact thing with my athlete, because they may be different athletes, you may have different space constraints. So like you can take some of these ideas, but it gets really kind of frustrating, I think, sometimes for a lot of clinicians and PTs of like, where do I even start? It's overwhelming versus, when you're working with resistance training things, or we talk about like ACL and you talk about like quad profiling on an isokinetic dynamometer and these testing, even like more rigorous jump training type stuff where you're using like the My Jump app, like these things we can titrate and control and measure a little bit more closely. But change of direction, man, it's just, it can be so overwhelming and chaotic, and it does feel like the wild west out there for a lot of people, because there's so much that you can consume on social media of like this and that and this and all these implements and things that you don't even know where to start. And so first I would say embrace that it is chaotic. Change of direction is by nature inherently going to be chaotic. Getting into a game environment, depending on what you're reacting to, whether that's a ball or another athlete, there's going to be a level of chaos, right? We talk about this like open learning, this ecological model of like motor programming has to be done over time, and it's through exposure. And so we know that as people get exposed back to their sport and they have the requisite qualities and things that you've built for them, like good things are going to happen as they're exposed, but you can maximize their exposure in graded formatting in a clinical setting if you know what the general frameworks are for these things. And that's kind of hopefully what we'll outline a little bit today. So it doesn't feel like it's just complete random chaos. And so hopefully we give some people some good stuff here, because you think about even how that fits within a different athlete. Let's say you understand the framework that I'm going to outline. You're still going to have to take this into an athlete or sport specific context that makes more sense. For example, a tennis player is not going to be getting up to really high max velocity speeds and coming in and out of change of directions, because that the court is just too small. Their space is too small. However, they're going to have a lot more change of directions in a given period of time, and it may be even more random because you don't really know how long the match is going to go. You don't really know what you're going to have to be reacting to. It changes by opponent, it changes by surface, changes by times of the year, of how many of these matches you're going to have to play back to back to back to back. So like their demands are going to be very different versus maybe next tier up would be like basketball. Right now you do have a little bit more space to get up to speed, even though you're still having the amount of change of directions similar to tennis, where there's a lot of them in a short period of time. But now you have another component where you have to take horizontal velocity and change it into vertical velocity, right? There's another something to think about that you didn't have to think about with the tennis player. Or volleyball as well, you have to always be oriented to face a net and shuffling more and getting vertical again. Soccer, now you have a lot more velocity, but now there's an implement at the feet, so it's very different. Or lacrosse, now you have an implement in the hand, and you still have now a very large field where you're going into high velocity XLs and decels. Or football as well, which truly, you take out all the implements now, it's just no more than a ball in your hand that you get to carry. Now with football, you see probably the most high velocity changes of direction happening with very large people, and a very large perturbation potentially coming in trying to hit you. So all of these demands of different sports really will be different, but hopefully the framework of how you program and think about change of direction, especially in a clinical setting, will get a little bit more tight down. So I can keep going, Chris, but if you wanted to stop me and hit on anything from there, we can.
No, keep rocking and rolling. I like it.
Okay. So let's talk about quickly the requisite qualities that are needed from a tissue standpoint or strength standpoint. Now we know when we talk about ACL stuff, we have all of these benchmarks of where we want people to be on these quad related indexes, as well as vertical jump profiling, single leg jump, single leg landing type stuff. Without getting into the weeds of all of that specific to ACL, we'll try to make this more broad just across all athletes. First, the athlete does have to have some requisite strength. Change of direction has a very large demand on eccentric strength. And that eccentric strength profiling will be very important in change of direction work because of the deceleration demands, specifically on the knee joint. Versus if I go more into acceleration, the knee doesn't need to do quite as much of the work. We always talk about when people are dealing with knee related issues, they have a gas pedal but not a brake pedal. It's kind of the same. So you need to have brakes. So some things that come into the research side of things with the brake pedal is the vastus lateralis, the soleus, groin, and the hamstrings. Now, hamstring seems like a little kind of a weird one because that seemed more of like a propulsive type of thing. But really, when you're decelerating, you got to think that I have very, very high limb speed to replace the foot out in front of me. And then you're also going to have some trunk lean into a forward orientation while that foot is coming out in front of me. So there is going to be an eccentric demand on the hamstrings as I come into decel. And if you've worked with athletes for a while, you'll know that hamstring strains do happen, maybe not in as often as they do with acceleration type stuff or sprint related stuff, but change of direction hamstring pulls are fairly common, and also something pretty common to irritate a previous hamstring injury. If somebody's been dealing with it and they go into an aggressive decel, that can be something that lights that up. So those are kind of the primary muscle groups that are talked about. Now, when we talk about exercises to train that, I do think it's important to cover here that even though a lot of people really hang their hat on back squat or these big, large, hinge pattern or for lack of a better term, people do think of these as like functional movements. And I think that terminology is bunk altogether, that there's not anything functional about what you do in the weight room unless the weight room is your sport. But you can improve tissue qualities and demands there. So when you think about like a back squat, it's pretty easy to hide a weak quad in a back squat or to hide some deficiencies. So like just work on loading the tissue of interest. So like doing something like a Smith machine squat with the feet slightly out in front of you, or putting the feet low on the platform of a leg press machine, that kind of stuff. Doing a knee extension exercise, that is poo-pooed a lot, and it can be a controversial topic, but it shouldn't be. You're just trying to load the tissue of interest in a isolated way so that when you do have to use it on the field, which you're always going to be doing and baking into rehab anyways, that it's there. That is something we need. Now, when I say the soleus is something that is talked about a lot with change of direction. It is important. And when people think soleus, they think seated calf raise machine. You do not need to do a seated calf raise. The seated calf raise doesn't, do a better job training the soleus than a normal calf raise. If you just do a straight leg calf raise, you're still going to be working the soleus. In fact, you may even work the soleus more because the total load demand can be higher. But if you wanted to like really limit the demands of the knee or hip coming into that, sure, you can do a seated calf raise. I'm just saying that when we say soleus, you don't have to do a seated calf raise machine. So clinicians that don't have one, don't freak out. It's okay. And then, what's really funny is there's also a lot of people that hate kettlebell swings and say they're totally useless. There's a study from 2013 by Zebis et al., and they talked about the kettlebell swing actually has like a pretty similar electromyographical profile to the medial hamstring group in as change of direction type stuff. So you don't have to call exercises good or bad. There's not one, thing that you have to do. Just make sure you're loading the tissues. And that's just kind of a funny little aside that, some people really hate on the kettlebell swing, but it may actually have some similar crossover to change of direction, especially with the wide base of support that you typically get in the kettlebell swing. A couple more things qualitatively is a sit versus fold. When we talk about change of direction, a lot of the time when we're going to stop, we want to see that athletes are able to sit down in a chair, that they're able to keep their torso and their center of mass more over the top of their feet and ankles versus getting folded forward. This is very, very common in the ACL world. We talk a lot about this when we do horizontal jump testing, that like people can get away with a very folded, very hip dominant strategy where they can just let their torso bend and fold. They don't really have to bend the knee at all. They can get it out of other structures at the hip and propel themselves forward. It's the same as if I'm coming into a decel and I let my head and my trunk really get far over my toes as I'm coming into a decel, versus what you should see is them sit down more into a chair. But to be able to do that, you have to have very strong soleus and quad type availability in the tissues to do that. And something like as simple as a knee extension or these more hack squatty, upright squats will do a pretty good job of getting people to sit in a chair, which we want them to do and change direction as well. Now we can talk a little bit more about how to do that, some of that stuff on field, like ways that you can implement some strategies. You can do a lot more shuffling, which is a little bit easier entry point. You can hold sticks overhead to get people into more of a sitting strategy versus a folding forward strategy. Even where you put a resistance band on someone can help change their strategy from becoming more of a folded strategy into more of more of that sit strategy that we want to see. So there is that, just some prerequisite qualities. You look like you got something here.
Yeah, the sit versus fold. Can you just elaborate on the maybe downsides or why a fold is maybe not the most productive strategy?
Yeah, absolutely. So going back to just thinking about something as simple as the hamstrings, if I fold forward a lot in a decel and I have this really large excursion of my head and shoulders and trunk coming forward, but I'm also now, the foot has to come out in front of my center of mass as well for it to be decelerative in nature, that you're going to put a lot more strain on the posterior side, in a hamstring group. Boom. So there's one thing, just kind of in reverse order, talking about the hamstrings. Now, big thing too is when we talk about the knee, and maybe this is probably the more important side of things, especially for those coming back from a knee related injury, especially maybe ACL. That if I have a very stiff knee strategy coming into decel, I'm asking a lot of these passive structures, such as the ACL, to take on more force. There's going to be more shearing of the tibia on the femur. As I come into decel, you typically see people tear their ACLs from a very non-compliant knee strategy where they're trying to make decels or cut strategies with a very stiff knee. And it's at a certain force or a certain speed, the ACL can't handle that as the patellar tendon pulls that shin forward and that stiffer, shallower knee angle. So if you get into like a very deep knee angle, it almost becomes impossible, if not it is impossible, to tear an ACL once the knee is bent beyond about 40, 45 degrees, or maybe even as deep as 30 degrees. It can be very challenging to tear the ACL at those depths. And so we want to see more of this compliant knee strategy, but it also gives, from a performance side of things, people options. If I get so bent forward, my head and shoulders are over my feet, just from a practical standpoint, like I'm not going to be a very adaptable athlete in a chaotic environment to react to an opponent. So even if we're not talking about injury and we're just purely talking about performance side of things, and maybe I'm not so worried about, the knee joint specifically as they're coming back from an ACL, but I'm dealing more with like an ankle or the hamstring thing or a groin injury or you name it, any number of things, even if it's a low back pain, related case, I don't want to get folded forward because it gives me a lot less options of what do I do with that. Once I'm folded forward and all of my center of mass is now out over my toes, I can't make a good cut to my right or my left. I can't retreat. I can't orient myself to a changing ball position or opponent position because my eyes are going to be really difficult to keep up and oriented to the space around me. So getting folded forward has a number of implications, both on the injury side as well as the performance side of things. And hopefully just a couple of those examples help clear some of that up.
Yeah, that was helpful. You initially started with the prerequisite qualities, which the four main kind of muscle groups to make sure you're consistently loading in maybe an isolated manner and integrating into change direction is soleus, hamstrings, quads, adductors. And if you're seeing significant deficits maybe in one side versus the other, inability to maybe progress the loading in a more of a controlled resistance training manner, it's probably a sign that from a change of direction standpoint, likely those tissues or those joint angles aren't going to want to be expressed or utilized. Is there anything that you wanted to touch on with those kind of prerequisite characteristics or training qualities?
Yeah, I mean, you could. There's other muscle groups too that you could throw in there. Like you could definitely throw in the trunk type stuff, or really any number of stuff that you're seeing with your athlete. Those are just probably the more researched muscle groups. Those are the ones that tend to be talked about a little bit more in the research literature that have been studied. But those are not in any way a comprehensive list of like, here's the ones that, once these are strong, you're good to go. Because there may be a lot of other things happening and how those systems are coordinated together well or not well in an athlete returning. You also have a massive psychological piece of just the apprehension of, I may have some requisite, strength in the weight room, but that doesn't mean that it's transferring super well onto the field just yet because I haven't had enough exposure to learn. So I don't think we need to go into any of the testing parameters. I think that probably goes beyond the scope of what we're trying to get out of this podcast, but just understand that those are going to be things to check the list off first, which I think in general, strength and conditioning coaches, as well as physical therapists are doing much better at loading these tissues and getting people really strong. And I think now where we go is like, okay, those are all very conveniently placed implements in more static positions that I can measure, I can test, I can see the weight either go up or down. It's a little bit easier to do those types of things. Then it's like, okay, well, now I want to go onto the field. Now what?
Yeah. So now what?
Yeah. So let's talk about this. So just let's talk about the quality of change of direction. Going over some more of the qualitative scoring, and then we can go into a little bit more of the programming and how this actually looks in practice. But for those really curious about multi-directional speed and changes of direction, there is a really great group that's associated with the Aspetar group called the Science of Multi-Directional Speed. They have a great website, extensive blogs filled with so many resources as far as research literature goes. And I think that they just do a phenomenal job outlining a lot of change of direction stuff and testing and measuring. I mean, just so much. So check them out. I can't speak highly enough about them and the work that they're doing, and I really appreciate everything that they do. But something they have is this, it's called the CMAS. And there's about 9 bullet points that they go through, and we'll go through them here just so people get an idea of each one and give some little brief examples. Number 1 is that in change of direction, whether it's linear decel, meaning I'm just running in a straight line and stopping in a straight line, or if it's a change of direction in terms of, I'm running in a straight line and I got to go back behind me, or I got to, come to a slight stop and then make a 90-degree cut or even a 60-degree cut. We just want to see that there is a clear braking strategy. That is point number 1, that there is some kind of action happening where it's clear that there was an anti-penultimate, a penultimate, and a final foot contact to that change of direction. Anti-penultimate is 2 steps before the final foot contact of when the actual change of direction or that blocking step happens. The penultimate step is the one right before. So, and if you think about like something that's really simple for people to imagine in their minds is a 180-degree cut, like if I'm running in a straight line and I have to now run straight back behind me, like a 505 or a pro agility test. As I'm coming in, there's going to be one brake step. That's the antepenultimate. Then on my penultimate step, I'm going to start turning to position my trunk and feet to the side. So that's the penultimate step, almost what it looks like if somebody were to go up for a dunk. It's that big forward reaching step right before that final foot step blocks them and takes them vertical. And then there's that final foot contact, that blocking step that happens outside their frame, that places that on the line or near the line, and then they take no more steps and continue to accelerate in the opposite direction now. So you have anti-penultimate, penultimate, and then the final foot contact. Hopefully that makes sense. If you're not sure what I'm talking about, you can just look up this CMAS, and it makes it very clear. Without seeing it visually, it can be a little difficult to imagine. But then you have wide leg plants or a wide lateral leg plant to the step that you're looking at. So that is point number 2. We want to see that the foot gets outside the frame of support. Something that's interesting to think about here is that in acceleration, we typically see that the contact distance away from the center of mass, we want to see that contact distance shrink, meaning that the foot is contacting more under the hip with every progressive step, that when I'm finally at my max top end velocity, that foot is hitting very close, striking the ground very close to under the center of my hip. Versus in deceleration, it's the opposite. You'll see that when somebody comes in with speed and they already have this foot strike pattern that's close to their center of mass, that we want to see that distance increases with every step that they take, and that final foot contact is going to be very far outside of their center of mass. So it's kind of the inverse of what we're looking at, which makes sense, XL to decel. So that's point number 2. Point number 3 is that we're looking for rotation at the hip and the trunk. So when I come into that penultimate step that we talked about with the 180-degree turn, for example, there needs to be a lot of rotation happening, right? I'm preparing the foot contact, I'm preparing the trunk, and I'm preparing that hip, the orientation of my femur, which will dictate the orientation of the shin and the foot into the direction that I want to go. So we want to see that rotation is happening, or that they're starting to orient into the direction that we intend them to go, or that they're reacting to, or whether that's more reactive or that's a pre-planned activity. Point number 4 is that we want to see some initial knee valgus. We want to see that foot, again, is outside of the knee joint. And this is maybe something that can be controversial, or maybe not controversial, but I think taught very poorly typically in clinic, is that we typically do a lot of weight training exercises with the knee in line with the foot and the toe. And that's even a cue you'll hear so often is, like keep the knee in line with the foot. But in change of direction, we actually do want to see that the knee gets inside the edge of the foot. That dictates shin angle, that dictates projection angle of where I go after. So I can't have my knee in perfect alignment with my foot unless I'm just coming into an extremely linear deceleration, right? That's probably the only time that it matters. But even then, you do want to see a widening of their base of support as they come into a decel versus, if I'm running upright at top end speed, it's going to look like I'm running on a very narrow, like tightrope or balance beam, because my foot strike pattern is very close together, because I'm trying to limit how much lateral excursion I get per step. But then as I come into decel, I want to see a widening of that base of support. So you're still going to see that foot come outside the knee slightly, even in a purely linear deceleration. And that's good. We want that to happen. That's not something that should be taught out of an athlete. Point number 5 is the foot shouldn't be in a perfectly neutral position. So again, we're getting more out of these neutral things. And this is where we start talking about change of direction being a little bit more chaotic sometimes. And why that is, let's say I'm running straight ahead and I want to go to my left side. Well, my right foot needs to plant in the turf or the grass or the court in order to then get me over to my left side. That right leg is going to come outside of my base of support. But if my foot is facing purely up and down, what that opens you up to is potentially rolling to the outside of the ankle, right? We see a little bit more propensity to roll over the ankle and get those like ATFL common ankle strains when the foot stays neutral. And so just like what you would do with someone in a squat, for example, you just have them turn their foot out slightly. That buys them a little bit more range of motion and dorsiflexion to allow the shin to come forward. You do the same thing and change of direction. Just a slight foot turn to the outside at an angle will significantly help them. You basically take something that is more in the sagittal plane and you rotate it into the frontal plane, because I'm trying to now add movement in the frontal plane. So by getting my lever of the actual foot to get more into that frontal plane, I'm buying a little bit more stability of rigidity in that motion versus being able to roll over the outside of the ankle because there's nothing there. I've just gained a little bit of a lever system to get me over to that side by rotating the foot out ever so slightly versus holding it neutral. So that is point number 5. We still doing good? Okay. So point number 6 is the front trunk position. So when we talk about like this frontal plane, right? I don't want to see that my frontal plane is laterally shifting. We call that like a big sway kind of looking thing. You're going to have a big energy leak is another term that's used a lot, because if I go to plant, again, let's use that same example just so people can stay with us here. And I want to go to the left and I got to plant my right leg into the ground. Well, if my upper half continues to travel horizontally over my base of support, and now I have this big sway where my center of mass is over the top of that right foot, even if my right foot is outside my knee and hip, now I have my head and my shoulders that are almost over the top of that right foot. I've swayed to that side. That's going to take me a long time to get back to my left-hand side, right? You have this big sway, this energy leak. But also when we talk about groin-related strain and injury now, you've drastically increased the amount of force that's going to be going through the groin because of that trunk sway. So if I can pre-rotate a little bit that femur, I can rotate the trunk and orient my center of mass from above the waist into the direction that I want to go versus it leaking over the top of my base of support. That will be significant in its speed of how quickly you make that change of direction, as well as potential injury risk can go down by just getting a little bit better at that type of a task. So there's point number 6. Point number 7, we're almost through. There's 9 points. Point number 7 is trunk upright or leaning back during final foot contact. So we talked a lot about this. This is that sit versus fold. So point number 7 is truly just that, the sit versus fold. Point number 8, limited knee flexion during final foot contact. So we talked a lot about how we don't want this folding because of stiff knee strategies. We want more compliance. And that's true up until that final foot contact. So when we're coming into decel, those initial couple of steps of the deceleration, the antepenultimate and penultimate steps, some of those steps leading from coming in at high velocities and having to initiate our slowdown, you're going to see very, very high ground reaction forces happen in those initial steps. You're going to see very high limb speeds because you're having to replace the foot onto the ground so quickly because you have so much velocity coming in, right? So you're going to see a lot of forces happen on the initial point of things. And that's where we want to start sitting. We want to have more of the center of mass dropping. But when I hit that final foot contact, that blocking foot, Now I've essentially amortized, or I've coupled enough to where I've slowed down, and you have kind of this stillness between eccentric and concentric demands, where everything has kind of become a little bit more isometric. And now I'm starting to transition from slowing myself down back into acceleration. So that final foot contact is really where we want to see a little bit more of a stiff strategy happen at the knee, because I've already complied. I've already dropped my center of mass. Now I need to create some kind of stiffness of blocking that limb, blocking that foot to get me to accelerate in a new direction. So we do want to see some stiffness on that final foot contact. That's point number 8. Point number 9, last one. You made it this far. You're doing great. Is excessive knee valgus during final foot contact. It is what we want to see. That's a good thing. So that very final foot. So while I have in point number 2 that I want to see widening, and that I want to see in point number 4, initial knee valgus position, initial knee valgus, that might be slight, but that final foot contact, that's again going from decel, or excuse me, going from XL to decel. We want to see a widening of my contact distance away from my center of mass. That final foot contact is really going to be the one that is furthest away from my center of mass, because now I'm truly trying to get projection angle. I'm trying to get that shin angle to drop enough to project me in a new direction. You'll see what happens. I call it like the whip and nae nae. If anybody can imagine the whip and nae nae dance, when people come into a change of direction and they plant that foot down and then they kind of just get bounced up, right? I don't want to whip and nae nae. I want to put that foot down on the ground and go a new direction. I got to transition my hips and shoulders into a new direction. I don't want to just get popped up. And you see that happen a lot when people don't get the foot outside their base of support, or they don't allow the knee to come inside the foot to create that lateral line in order for them to go in a new direction. They will get popped up. And so that's what that last point is talking about, is that we want to see this quote unquote, this excessive knee valgus, because that determines my exit velocity. It determines my exit direction. You're going to find that it's a lot easier to apply force, even if you're not a very strong or propulsive athlete. You can still gain a lot more ground by getting more efficient in your angles, versus just purely getting stronger or getting faster. And so those angles really start to matter a lot, especially at that final foot contact. So those are the 9 points of the CMAS. I don't know if there was any ones in there that you wanted to particularly cover or had questions about.
Yeah, those 9 are super helpful, and I'm sure if people go to that website that you were talking about, the multidisciplinary speed, or what is it? The
The
science
science
of
of multi-directional speed.
Yeah, we'll link it, and then the CMAS within that and listing it out. Those all make perfect sense, and I don't know if on that website they just have like pictures of each one or
They
slow
do.
motion videos. Yeah, so for people who want to visualize it again, go to that, and we'll link it in the show notes. Any in particular? I mean, they're all so good. I think what I was going to bring up, but ended up being the next point. You talking about minimizing that trunk sway during that cutting portion of that almost seems just like a frontal plane, like that folding strategy that you were talking about. And then the next point is that minimizing the folding itself
Mm-hmm.
in the more sagittal plane. So in general, the torso and trunk, and kind of the hip, it should be relatively upright or should be leaning to the other direction as opposed to that plant leg when you're cutting. And then that maybe what some people think is a counterintuitive, very wide base of support or wide cutting angle. And I feel like Lee Taft does a great job with this, with some of his even just like old school YouTube videos, but emphasizing how wide the feet should be during some of these drills and during just the realities of change of direction. That is maybe counterintuitive or what people think is risky, but it is so much more efficient and productive and probably feel smoother once people start training in those positions. There's nothing I think within those 9 that I want to dive into more so, but I think for people that want to look more into it, having those visuals and utilizing that resource is great.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, where do you want to go from here?
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. I think Lee Taft is just one of those complete all around great people to listen to for change of direction. What I love about Lee, and I promote him and I talk about him all the time because I think he does such a great job of you could take a lot of his drills or ideas and it applies to an elementary school athlete or it applies to the most elite high level basketball player on the planet. It will apply to all of them because it's so fundamental, it's so foundational, and there's so many ways to add layers to it. That I think he does a phenomenal job. I think there's a group that works alongside Jonas Dodu with Speedworks that is also kind of attached with some of these multi-directional or the science of multi-directional speed that do YouTube videos. They do continuing education and workshops across the country and across the world, really, that I think do a really good job. They're out of the UK. And Jason Fieldheller is another one to follow on Instagram. He does a lot of really cool stuff. A good Lee Taft, disciple back in the day, but it has a lot of really fun, interesting ideas of how to combo things and how to add some of resistance and how to add plyo boxes and progressions and regressions. So I am a big follower of a lot of these people. I steal a lot of ideas and try to put it together and make it make sense for myself. And so, yeah, I just can't speak highly enough about some of the folks that you've, highlighted here. So great stuff. I think where I'd go from here is, let's talk briefly just about some other potential considerations that I think can go into this qualitative thing. And then we'll get into some plyometrics because plyometrics is something that applies very similarly to change of direction, if that's cool. Cool. So just really quickly with the qualitative stuff with task specificity, here's some things to consider. Is this oriented towards offense or defense? Offensive strategies are going to be a little different than defensive strategies. Defensive strategies, you're going to have more retreating, more shuffling, and reacting of going backwards into a forward motion versus offensive strategies tend to be more pre-planned. You tend to have a little bit more intense change of directions or cutting at shallower angles if I'm attacking, for example. So those are going to be a little bit different, as well as, are we trying to close distance or are we trying to create space? That also goes into this offensive versus defensive strategy. The mode of travel may differ. So we have change of direction is one thing where there's a clear braking strategy and a change of direction truly, versus something that they call maneuverability, or maybe even something that's called like agility could fall into this as well, where it's more of, I'm maintaining a high velocity, I'm just changing the mode of travel ever so slightly, and there's kind of a little bit of chaos. It's not really clear when the change of direction specifically happened, those types of things where the maneuverability is like, I'm going from, if it's a defensive player, I'm going from a back pedal to a crossover sprint into a sprint, and maybe have like one slight angle orientation as I'm sprinting to orient myself to the offensive player who's trying to catch the ball, right? That'd be maneuverability versus true change of direction. Offensively, this may be, I'm trying to get open for a ball, and I've made my initial change of direction to make my cut to get open. But then as I'm getting open, I may have to weave a little bit. I may have to go into a shuffle as I catch the ball to orient myself to the basket or to the goal or to the opponent that I need to redodge. Again, that would be maneuverability. So there's some different considerations there just in the changes of mode of travel. You got to consider, is there opposition? Am I taking perturbation? Am I reacting to something or not? What's the level of competition, and at what stages do those come in? And then we just have to ask, was the task successful? And as you get closer to return to play, that's really, you stop becoming such a mechanic in terms of what you're looking at in the CMAS scoring, and you start considering more of just simply, were they successful at completing the task? And now you can start working on maybe breaking down components of how to make them more successful or how to make them more efficient at that task. But at the end of the day, you have to start becoming a little bit more task specific as you get through that. Now, when we talk about the sitting and the trunk sway, we have to ask, were they really chaotic? If they had to make a second move or a third move, could they? Or were they so out of control and leaned forward that there was no way that they were going to be reacting again? Did both limbs end up on one side of the body or not? When we talk about change of direction and the widening of the base, I want to see that I'm not coming into a hockey stop, is what they call it, where, if you look at a hockey player and as they come on the ice into a hard stop, both skates get on one side of their frame, right? Because they're using the ice, and you'll see the big, ice spray. It's really impressive. but we don't want to see that necessarily happen on the field where both feet end up on one side of my body. You're almost always going to have one foot under your center of mass, and then the other foot is outside your frame. So did they get, and maybe where the exception is that is like a jump cut in football or something like that, where, you kind of got put in a weird position and you're just jumping out of the way, but that's not a strategy that lends itself to a second or third move. It's kind of like a one last ditch effort type move. And you're opening yourself up to like, it's a full send, full sail in that direction versus like something that's more efficient and grounded. And then, maybe symmetry. We can talk a little bit about symmetry and how you can measure that. You can use the My Jump app and just measure people from the side as well as straight on. And you can just do things like RSIs, or you can do things like even jump height. And just even though you're not jumping or you're not truly measuring RSI the way that we typically think about it, you can still use the frame by frame on the jump app and figure out if I always measure the right leg on their, 2 steps coming into the decel versus the left side, the same steps, what's the time look like? And you can start teasing out what's really happening from side to side. Are we symmetrical? You can even just use the coach's eye and a slow motion camera, right? And just figure out like, well, are they really wanting to bend that knee, or are they really relying on that final foot contact versus getting into the leg on that penultimate step? So these types of considerations are important. We already talked about the popping up, the whip and nay, the angles. Were they able to manage velocity? If we talk about, if you wanted to test these kinds of things, you could use timing gates, the 5:05 test, the 5:10.5 test. We want to make sure that people are coming in with at least 90% of their velocity that they would attain if they just had to run a straight line through the cone or through the line that we're having them stop on, because you'll find that athletes cheat all the time. We could go on a whole podcast just about testing alone, and we don't need to do that. But these are just a lot of other considerations to think about if we're talking about qualitatively what we're testing, what we're looking for, a couple of different options that you have in the bank. I don't want this to get overwhelming for people. Just know that like there's a lot of different directions that if you do want to get curious and you want to measure things, there are plenty of options to be able to do that. So with that being said, should we get into maybe go ahead and get into the plyometric type stuff and how that applies to how we program change of direction now?
Yeah, let's rock with the plyos.
Okay. So plyometrics, there's always going to be, for something to be plyometric, there has to be a flight time in and a flight time out. There has to be both flight time on both sides. So, things like a counter movement jump or things like a box jump are not considered plyometric technically, because there's not like a falling or a flight time in and a clear contact point and an exit velocity out type of thing. So we need that to happen, which is kind of similar to change of direction. There's always going to be some velocity in and some velocity out in change of direction. So I think there's a nice carryover from plyo to change of direction. We'll talk about that a little bit more. But I think Matt McInnes Watson has just done an incredible job. If you're not familiar with him, the Plus Plyos program, I'll put in a plug for him because I think it's an amazing tiered system of how he's outlined how to program plyometric training. And it also just totally demystifies where do we even start in something that's equally complex in ways. And we're going to use a lot of what he does in this tier system of how we apply to this change of direction, how I think about this. And this is just my strategy. I'm not saying this is the best or the only way. People have levels that they like to do as well. But I think this is a very feasible way to do that will hopefully turn into some good educational courses and programs down the road for people to get a framework of how to do this all. But just to cover the plyos, he has things called a ping tier, a medium tier, a deep tier, and a light tier. So to define these, a ping tier is something that's really truly maximal effort. These are usually more simple plyometrics, not very complex, because there has to be such a high degree of effort. Once you increase complexity, the same is true for change of direction. Once you start adding in a lot of different complex movements and a lot of combos of movements and this and that and this and that, you actually are increasing complexity, but you're not increasing intensity because the entry and exit velocities are so low that in a ping tier plyometric, you want things to be relatively simple so that you can just give it the most attention to effort and great contacts and great maximal pushing, right? So things that fall into this category would be just like repeat pogos for maximal height, spending the least amount of time on the ground, but getting as high as possible every single time, or a really high depth drop, that's really training true physiological qualities. We're trying to change tendon. We're trying to change our ability to adapt and adjust to really high forces and high loads. Then we have medium tier plyos, things in the middle. These are somewhere in between the light tier and the ping tier. And the medium tier is used as more of like learning opportunities at levels that are still fairly intense. So I'm still getting a great training stimulus, but this is kind of similar to like resistance training. Like I may only hit my top sets, once in the workout. You're going to build up, you're going to hit a top set, and then you got all your back off work. That's a pretty consistent or similar training strategy that most people will be familiar with. That's kind of similar in the plyometric world, where you build up, you hit your ping tier stuff, the high, really high stimulus yield that you can't do a lot of volume of, and then most of your work happens in this medium tier stuff, as far as the same type of movements, the same type of bounding, these same type of repeat pogo type stuff. You can get a little bit more complex because it's not quite as intense, but think of these as like 70 to 80%. This is true with change of direction as well. Like you just can't do really, really high velocity decels. You just can't do really, really high velocity, even sprinting. If we were just talking about linear speed training, I can't do all that much volume of that stuff before I'm running out of gas or I'm starting to see significant decreases in performance from rep to rep because of fatigue. So this medium tier stuff is going to be big meat and potatoes, as well as the light tier stuff. Light tier plyometrics would be little poppy plyos, and you can think of like even like little pogos, little alternating pogos. You can really get complex with these. You can have swivels, you can jump in circles, you can go 45-degree angles. These can get a lot more fun and just kind of playful. Think about like jump roping. Think about, for change of direction, this may be like speed ladder stuff. I don't love speed ladder because it typically teaches people to be more poppy and frequent and not really go anywhere, but it can be a great entry point just for building a capacity early on in the rehab setting. And those light tier plyos are very similar to what we'd expect to get in terms of forces with a speed ladder. Just these more poppy small contacts, getting good at getting on and off the ground and just building capacity. Lastly, you have deep tier. So deep tier stuff is more compliant strategies, deeper ranges of motion while still maintaining some kind of elasticity. Think about this as like a repeat broad jump, but not for maximal height or distance. But thinking about, I'm just trying to land softly, I'm trying to be compliant, but still maintain velocity, still maintain some of that spring going into the next one. Deep tier stuff is more about muscular training versus the tendon related training. When we think about some of the other tiers in the plyometric series, those are more dealing with high energy storage and release. The deep tier plyos is more of compliancy and getting good at bending joint angles, at using muscular strategies to create force, which does need to happen in sport and can support your overall plyometric program. So those are the just quick coverage of some of the plyo stuff. If you want to know more about that or how to program those or a lot more detail into plyometric in general, please check out Matt McInnes Watson and the Plus Plyos program. He does a fantastic job of doing that, and I think it will make programming your plyos very easy. But now, as we start translating all of this plyo stuff of ping, medium, light, and deep tier, and we have a little bit in this conversation just to this point, started giving people an idea of where this might come in with change of direction. Here is a framework of how I have outlined the change of direction by tiers. So are we ready? All right. If we need to write all these out and give these to people, we can do that. But like I said, I'm hoping to make a course and a program for all this in the future. So glean what you can out of this and maybe look to the future of what's coming. So we'll start with light tier. So we'll start with just the light stuff, because I think this is where we'll start with. Like rehab is typically light, or maybe even deep tier things early on in rehab is where people can tolerate things because the forces are low. I can still accumulate capacity without worrying about high risk, and it's usually tolerated a little bit better. So in light tier, we have low entry and exit velocities. Okay, when I say low entry and exit velocities, we're typically thinking of something less than or equal to 5 yards. If you wanted to actually test and measure an athlete of where their force velocity profile is, like with a 1080 sprint, and see exactly where they're hitting these percentage points, you could do that. But in general, I've used these yard points because it will cover the large majority. And when I say large majority, I mean like, over 90% of athletes will typically fall within these parameters. And distance, how far you run, if you're running with great intention, will determine the velocity that you get up to. So when we say low entry velocity, low entry and exit, I'm thinking, something within 5 yards is going to keep my entry and exit velocities quite low. These can be moderate complexities. You can have maybe greater than or equal to 3 changes of direction, probably a lot. Even if you think about like a speed ladder, I mean, there's technically there's 20 or 30 changes of direction happening in a continuous manner in something like a speed ladder, because it's just back and forth, back and forth. But each one of those changes of directions is such a low amount of force that you can accumulate a lot of volume there, which is fine. That's the purpose of the light tier stuff. So ground contact times are typically going to be dependent on the angle of change, right? If I have to make, like even in 5 yard space, I have to make a 180 degree change of direction, my ground contact times are going to be a lot longer because I have to come to a full stop and turn and go the other direction. Versus if I just make a very shallow cut after 5 yards and I make like a 30 degree cut, I can maintain a lot of velocity. That ground contact time is going to be relatively shorter. So I have to be mindful of those ground contact times based on the complexity, the angle, and the nature that I'm asking people to change. And that can kind of alter where, the same way that if I was doing a light tier plyo, the difference between landing on 2 feet and a light tier versus landing on 1 foot on a light tier, that's going to change the force demand. And you just have to be mindful of where you're putting these demands and how you're progressing through this. But the same happens with change of direction and the angle of which I'm asking them to change the demand, because that changes the ground contact time. So generally you want lower ground reaction forces because you don't have, as much velocity coming in and out. Great. So there's light tier change of direction type stuff. All right. Medium. So let's go to medium tier here. We'll kind of go down the line. Medium tier now is you have moderate to high velocities. This is going to be somewhere between that 5 and 10 yards. Maybe between 50 and 80% of max velocity is what we're looking to get. The same way that we're thinking of a medium tier plyometric as being 70 to 80% of max effort, we think about velocities in that 70 to 80% range as well of the exit or the entry and exit velocities of these change of directions in the medium tier stuff. So it's not completely full tilt all out, but it's somewhere in between. Medium complexity. So now instead of having lots of change of direction, greater than 3, there may be only 2 to 3 at the most in this medium tier, because once you start adding so much complexity, you start really taking away from the intensity, like we said. So keep the number of change of directions you do a little bit lower, but this is somewhere in the middle. It can be higher than what you would get in ping tier, because now we can add and combo stuff like I was telling about Jason Fieldheller. He does like 2 or 3 moves that help with coordination and body orientation. This is your learning time with medium tier in doing something that's fairly intense, but it still exposes you to only velocities that still allow you to kind of keep your finger on the pulse of how quickly you go, so you can really truly learn this coordination of the movement. These are moderate to high ground reaction forces, generally oriented towards defensive play. Honestly, like if you think about defensive play is like we talked about earlier in the podcast, a little bit less planned. You're reacting, and you're also doing a little bit more shuffling and retreating and going from backwards to changing direction forward versus having a lot more velocity forwards and then breaking down. That does happen. But in general, like closing space versus trying to create space will have a little bit more of this medium tier feel to it. So anyways, your impulse off of one step is higher when cutting now, less than 60 degrees. We already talked about that. So just think, I usually use 60 degrees as my cutoff. If you're doing this in practice, you'll know that once you start getting about beyond 60 degrees of cutting, it starts really having to increase your deceleration demand, versus at about 60 degrees, I can just kind of, ping off that one step and continue my momentum in a similar direction. And I can really have a hard plant and continue momentum. But once you get deeper than 60, now I have to really start putting on the brakes more to get into a different direction. And that changes the demand of the impulse of that final foot contact. So 60 degrees is usually around my cutoff. And that's usually what's used in the research as well, is right around that 60 degree mark. And that's where that comes from. You could even tell people, if you wanted to do harder stuff with these, that you're just looking at the intent of being moderate, not looking for maximal intent. That can also just place something that would typically be ping tier into medium tier here. Okay. Oh, maybe last thing with medium tier is maneuverability. This is what we were talking about with the changes in mode of travel. This is where you would probably put a lot of that stuff, going from backpedaling to crossover stepping to sprinting, shuffling into an acceleration, that type of stuff, where you're not trying to completely change direction. You're just trying to change mode of travel in a similar direction. So anyways, okay, ping tier. There's a lot of information here. I hope people are not getting too overwhelmed, but I hope that these tiers systems kind of help people understand where we're coming from. This is high velocity stuff. So 10 yards or above. We're getting into 80% now or above. Typically, when you look at acceleration profiling, most athletes, field or court sport athletes, not even track athletes that are really highly proficient at this, but just the general athlete will typically start to hit between 70 and 80% of their velocity once they cross that 10-yard line. Somewhere between 10 and 15 yards, you're going to be getting up into that speed. And so now that's why I have ping tier being anything really above 10 yards. We're going to be starting to touch on some stuff that's more intense than anything below 10 yards. Now we get a lot less complex now. Right, low complexity in the ping tier. You can't have a whole lot of changes of directions, because even if I have, let's say, 2 changes of direction in a ping tier, that means I have to sprint in, let's say 15 yards sprint in, make a move, and then I have to sprint out for another 10 to 15 yards to then come to a decel. That's a lot of sprint volume that I'm getting in my change of direction work, that I just simply can't have that many changes of direction baked into one session or into one rep of a ping tier. So just make it really simple, make hard cuts or hard stops happen, and things will be a little bit more smooth to program versus trying to make it really complex once you get into the ping tier stuff. Again, ping tier plyos, you're just trying to get a maximal physiological stimulus. It's the same with ping tier change of direction. I'm trying to get a massive ground impulse. I'm trying to get really high ground reaction forces. I'm trying to create a lot of a physiological stimulus here, but I'm not trying to create an environment of high reactivity or gameplay where I'm here, then I'm there, then I'm backpedaling, then I'm transitioning, then I'm jumping. Just make it very simple and get a very high stimulus out of that change of direction when you come to ping tier. Okay, now deep tier, the last one. So this is low entry velocities. These are typically more drill based. This is stuff where you can start adding, you can bake this into your medium tiers as well, but I typically think deep tier is where we're doing resisted stuff with a sport cord or holding a med ball or a band attachment, or the clinician is adding some perturbation maybe in small spaces where they're having to put the brakes on in reaction to maybe I have like a big stability pole and I'm pushing on the athlete on their shoulder or hip, and they're having to like comply and get deeper, because again, these deep tier plyometrics are more compliant strategies, more muscular strategies. It's not this highly reactive to the ground type strategy, this highly springy, elastic nature type stuff. And I'm thinking the same with deep tier change of direction, is I just want athletes to get comfortable being compliant. Again, we talked about on the CMAS stuff that we do want to see that anti-penultimate and penultimate step be more compliant, that they're not having stiff strategies coming in. So we want to see that they're able to comply and get down and use muscular strategies. And that's where this kind of stuff in change of direction comes into play, is the resisted stuff, the back and forth on the line, just getting deep and coordinated into these motions, getting foot placement. I see people do building progressions where there's a line or a cone and it's like first step, second step, third step, 1, 2, 3, and they're just getting good at foot placement, but each time they're coming to like a freeze type of thing and they're just hitting positions. Those are all kind of deep tier baked stuff, just learning, coordinating, getting your feet under you, and more compliant strategies. Now with that, the sit versus fold, that's where you're going to make your money on teaching an athlete how to sit down versus folding, is adding resistance, slowing things down, having continuous. I think about telling athletes like pull your shoelaces up off the ground. Like I want you to pull your shoelaces up towards your knees, like getting that foot contact to be a little bit more flat versus on your toes and stabby. That will help them comply and sit down a little bit more in the chair. Or thinking about pulling the ground up to you, thinking about getting your, sometimes I even have athletes sit on a stability ball to start their change of direction. And I just think, okay, where you started from, in the middle of your change of direction, I want you to get back down to the ball. Think about you're sitting on that ball again. That's like that deep strategy, and I'm getting them to sit down. You can do a lot of work there early on in rehab between the light tier stuff where you're just doing more quick, bouncy, elastic type stuff at low levels, and then the deep deep tier stuff where you're trying to teach them strategies and compliancy to get good at these positions and attain postural control first before doing the more medium and ping tier related things down the road. And that may change based on, like, if you have a meniscus related athlete and they just can't get as deep, that's fine. You can still do deep tier stuff without having to get huge joint ranges of motion by still helping them sit low, by slowing the movement down, helping them not be stiff, but helping them learn compliant strategies and muscular strategies that they can burn, man. I mean, deep strategy, like, you could be super sore after this in the muscles, but it shouldn't be painful. But these can be used as a way of training the muscle and training the intent of the exercise a little bit differently than how you do in late stage return to play rehab. So hopefully that covers some things. I can go over briefly, one at a time, how I now multiply these. Like, if you have a certain number of change of direction or a certain number of yards, this may just take the whole thing and summarize it. Could I do that real fast? Okay. So with the type, so if you go deep tier, light tier, or medium tier in less than a 60-degree angle, medium tier less than a 60-degree angle, that means categorically you're under 5 yards or under 50% of max velocity in all of these. You just multiply whatever you did by 1. If you have, this number of contacts or this number of reps, you just multiply it by 1. And that's your final total volume for those type things. The next would be medium tier over 60 degrees. So if I have somebody cut more than 60-degree angle, meaning they have to have more deceleration, that also means it's medium tier. So I have beyond 5 yards, but still under 10. So I'm getting between that 50 and 80% of max V. I'm going to multiply it by 1.25, 1.25. So I just have to account that, like, that's going to be a little bit more stressful. So I'm going to multiply that total yardage by 1.25, or those total number of decels by 1.25. The ping tier, now it flips. The ping tier greater than 60 degrees. So a lot of decel, but still very high velocities, 70 to 80 or above, velocities greater than 10, maybe closer to 15 or 20 yards in your entry velocity. That I'm going to multiply by 1.5, 1.5, whatever, the number of contacts that I want, I'm going to multiply it by 1.5. The last one is a ping tier under 60. So ping tier, I'm coming in at high velocity and I have very low angle of change. That means I get to maintain a lot of velocity coming out of that change of direction. And it's a very high ground impulse. Boom, one quick motion. That's going to be extremely stressful on the joint, extremely stressful on the nervous system. So those I multiply by 1.75. And why I say multiply is that if I'm looking at how I'm programming this and I have this number that I want to hit, I'm going to share with you some totals or total yardage that I have. And it's a way of checking yourself that, like, you're not going to overdo it on some of these more stressful things. And it keeps people in check of, like, okay, I know I can't do too many of these things because it multiplies, so only 3 reps. I have to be very judicious of where I put those things because it's going to add up volume really quick, which is good, especially in rehab. So, when it comes to plyometrics, Matthew McInnes Watson talks about, like, somewhere in the 150 to 350 yard range is where you're looking to get. 150 is on the very low end, 350 is on the high end. He talks about yards being very applicable for group training, but you could do number of contacts as well. And the number of contacts, I can't remember off the top of my head what he dictated, but I want to say it's like somewhere in that, like, 60 to 100 zone of number of contacts that you would get in total. Now, acceleration, this is based on a lot of great sprint coaches from Altus and Speedworks and Stu McMillan and folks like that, but about 150 to 300 yards in a given session of acceleration work. 300 is a lot. Like, that's a lot of acceleration work. 150 maybe on the lower end for most athletes, and then change of direction is somewhere between that 150 and 350, or 15 changes of direction and 75 changes of direction. So if those are your total ranges that you're looking to get, now it's just a matter of, okay, well, what I programmed, I chose 3 exercises for light tier. I chose, 2 or 3 exercises for medium. I chose 1 for ping and 2 for deep. How many changes of directions are there? And I just use those multipliers of 1, 1.25, 1.5, and 1.75 to give me a total number of changes of direction on the session. And as long as I'm within about those parameters, I'm doing pretty good. And maybe early on, with the light tier stuff, you can get away with a little bit more. Like, if you're doing speed ladder type stuff, you might not need to count every single change of direction because they're so small and so little. But just keep in mind that volume will accrue very quickly. And sometimes less is more in this terminology. And I think that that can be a great thing. It's not, I'm not trying to tell people like, ooh, be careful, because you're going to overdo it and mess people up. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that like, you don't have to come up with an hour and a half plan to take somebody out on the field. And it doesn't have to be this crazy, elaborate, complex thing. I mean, most of the programs that are put out by the Aspetar group and even this multi-directional science or science of multi-directional speed group are 20 or 30 minutes long, and that's in their research papers. And they do a great job of just going through good progressions week over week, 8 to 10 week progressions, and people get better every time. So it doesn't have to be a lot. It just has to be well thought out. And I think that using this framework and tier system, similar to how we use in plyometrics, is a great way to help you program and help you get a feel for an idea of where are you really at. Because early on in rehab, you have more light and deep tier stuff. And then later in rehab, you're starting to undulate towards more medium and ping tier related stuff. As you get closer and closer, you're starting to add in more reactive elements. I know not everybody has the space or the ability to do that, and you can't always have an opponent. But again, going back to the beginning, I know it's important to add in reactive stuff, and I love it. I love that performance coaches talk about it and the neurocognitive side of things. That's great, but not every clinician can do that. So as long as you're preparing them from a physiological perspective, you're exposing them to both the loads in the weight room on specific joints and tissues that need to be strong, and that you're doing this in a way, you're programming change of direction in a way that you're exposing them to angles, loads, and positions, and even qualitatively helping them work through some change of direction progressions. Then as they do start getting back into practice, even at limited time points, you have 10 minutes or non-contact, and then you're going to go into some competitive drills. Now you're going into full competitive drills with time constraints, and then eventually no constraints. That's where they're going to get the exposure of this, reactive stuff, this opponent driven stuff as they're progressing through that. You don't have to do all of that by yourself. You can use the sport coaches, you can use practice elements to help you do that and help work through with the athlete, help them understand and learn what it is you're trying to do. Even with a young athlete, I did this with a young high school girl, and she totally got it. And she was able to like, oh yeah, like this became more ping tier at this part of practice. And I was like, damn, yeah, that's awesome that you understand what I'm talking about. And she limited her volume there, and they start to really buy into this process and be able to program for themselves. So hopefully this whole swath of things that we've covered, which is a lot, can really help people know how to move forward in a way that's less wild, wild west, even though it is a little bit chaotic.
Yeah, I foresee myself and a lot of listeners just re-listening to large chunks of this. This is the most I've written down during probably any episode, because it is a lot, but because it's kind of necessary to have some of these prerequisite things to discuss. I know we're over an hour, but I would love to go into at least one case study, what you think is the most valuable for the athlete that you want to discuss, and giving people kind of a true realistic look of how you implemented this with a particular athlete.
Okay. Yeah, I have a football player that was more of defensive oriented, or I have a lacrosse player that's more offensive oriented. What do you think would be best?
Let's do defensive.
Okay, gotcha. So football player, defensive back, so more speed and skill related, but still a defensive player looking to close distance. This person had a ankle injury, like a high ankle sprain. So they're missing some dorsiflexion, or at least that dorsiflexion going into it was very painful. And during like return to play type stuff, they had to get spatted up and a lot of tape on the ankle. So it was kind of a stub. And anytime that shin rolled over the front of the foot really hard, that was going to be pretty painful. And they didn't have as much push off of that ankle for that reason. So where do we start? Well, knowing that a defensive player is going to have a lot more retreating type strategy, and they're also going to have a little bit more lateral motion. That for the medium tier type stuff, we did a lot more just like backpedaling and shuffling into a backpedal, or backpedaling into shuffle type stuff, allowing the person to basically move away from dorsiflexion, allowing them to always be rolling through the foot in a direction that was away from it, really helped them early on to still interact with some higher speed stuff. So that was great. The light tier stuff was pretty easy. We start with bilateral contacts. We did, some lateral jumping. We did some just straight up and down, some jumping backwards. And when I say jump, I shouldn't even say jump. If I'm using the plus plyos, Matt McInnes Watson, it's a leap as double foot contact. I'm leaping. So leaping, we did 45-degree leaping, did some swivel leaping, a lot of very light tier stuff, but just trying to get them exposed to a lot of different positions, both lateral, diagonal and backwards that weren't really too aggravating that they could do, especially when they had double leg support. And you'll find that this is true for a lot of athletes, both knee and ankle. When you go to single leg support, athletes will typically do better with a very wide base of support, even if they're unilateral. So I have them do, it almost kind of looks like a skate hop, but you're just having a very kind of stiff knee strategy, and they're just very tiny little back and forth hops kind of thing. Or I should say bound, because you're alternating leg there. And we did a lot of that, more lateral stuff, just, getting just an inch off the ground each time, just back and forth, just to get some good foot contacts there. Now here's something interesting with it. I know that the T-step, for example, is such a controversial thing in football world of sport coaches teaching a T-step versus not a T-step. A T-step is essentially if I'm moving backwards, backpedaling, and then I want to change direction and go at a slight forward angle, either purely forward or a slight angle out of my back pedal. I need to now close distance. Some coaches will have their athlete basically turn the hip and knee to rotate externally and put the foot in the ground, which essentially makes a T with the front foot and the back foot, right? I'm getting the whole cleat in the ground, versus if I keep both of my feet forward, I can't get the trail legs foot all the way into the ground, because I would go into a lot of dorsiflexion or pop an Achilles. Like we see this happen with like the Jason Tatum recent injury in the NBA. Where he stepped back and the foot was more lateral, or more front to back, and you get a lot of Achilles load there, but it can be faster for some athletes. And so some coaches, no, we'll never T-step. Some coaches always T-step. But for someone dealing with a dorsiflexion limitation, especially an ankle position type thing, doing a T-step is just so massively critical for them to be able to learn a T-step that will get them back on the field a little bit faster, versus trying to ram into dorsiflexion again and again and again. So we worked on a lot of T-step drills, both T-step, backpedaling, coming into a perfectly linear decel and coming forward out of that T-step, then coming out at slight angles out of that T-step on both sides, and just giving them a lot of practice. That's kind of where we put a lot of the bulk of our change of direction medium tier stuff. Ping tier had to wait, right? Your ping tier type stuff is just going to have to wait. If you're going to do ping tier for an athlete coming back from, this type of thing, it may just be literally like backpedaling at max velocity. Like, how fast can you backpedal? How fast can you shuffle? Just give me like a 10-yard or a 15-yard max effort shuffle for speed, and then, or shuffle 10 yards and turn and make it into a sprint, for another 5, or backpedal, crossover run and sprint. Every 5 yards, you're going to change mode of travel. That way they can get and attain some decent velocity, but not have to like really throw on the brakes early on in rehab. So that's where we started. Amid all that, some deep tier stuff, we were doing a lot of resisted things with the sport cord, some med ball, just helping them get into that more sitted position. Now, because they had limited dorsiflexion, they either had to be a little bit more up on the ball of their feet than I like, or they just had to have shallower joint angles, because they couldn't sit down as far, because the shin wouldn't travel over the toe as far. And that's fine. I'm still getting them used to the idea of complying with resistance and load in positions that they can at that stage. And then we know that over the course of the next couple of weeks, this will improve, but we don't need to ram into it right away, or else it's just going to irritate things. But we do want to still have muscular strategies that are faster than what you get in the weight room. In the weight room, it was heels elevated squats. It was belt squat type stuff, because they could keep a little bit more vertical shin angle. It was, rear foot elevated split squat with a little bit more vertical shin angle type stuff that they could do, RDLs, that type of thing with more vertical shin. So we're not ramming into it. But then on the field, when I want things to be a little bit more elastic, but still muscularly compliant, we can do all that. We just have to know that it's going to look a little bit different early on, knowing that there's somewhere else we can go with it. But that, I think, gives kind of a general idea of where I started with more of a defensive player using some of the tier system. I hope that wasn't too broad.
Yeah, that was helpful. And is it fair to say that in a lot of athletes you're working with, you're introducing these change of direction drills or activities probably sooner than what people would expect, because you have this tier system or range of starting points or entry points, where some people may think, I need to check all these boxes for full joint range of motion, or these general orthopedic kind of clear indicators, and then resistance training, and then linear acceleration, and then going into change direction. Maybe people think like, I'm not introducing that until the end stage. But I think it sounds like your messaging is there's a lot of entry points, and there's some wiggle room. And then during that process, things will eventually clear up and you're doing multiple things at once. Is that fair to say?
Oh, 100%. Yeah. Even on the limb that's not injured, I mean, you could still do ping tier stuff. You could still do hopping. You can still do band assisted stuff if you want them to have more support and you're worried that they'll like land on their, operative leg or their involved side. You just don't want to, mess with the load there. You can still train their uninvolved side really hard during this. I would even say, yeah, having this tier system, having light tier stuff, you can do a lot of light tier stuff really early, even if it's like the lightest of light tier stuff. It's still in that direction. It's still getting the cleats on or getting the basketball shoes on, the tennis shoes on, whatever it is, and going to the place that they're going to play, or putting them in an environment that feels like practice in some ways, that they're doing something that feels like they're sporting, will be massively helpful and motivating for them. And even your deep tier stuff, it could be like small little oscillatory stuff in like a 1 or 2 inch range of motion that is at a deeper tier where you're just pulsing. You're not even leaving the ground yet. Or if you do leave the ground, it's like, just want to like slide a paper under your heel to start, just for like, a second or like a millisecond, just being able to slide paper. So you're just leaving the ground for a moment. That makes them feel like, wow, like I really am doing some things that are sporty, and I'm having my finger on the pulse of this problem, versus, well, we just did the past 6 weeks in the weight room. Now is day one of change of direction. Like, where do we go from here? You don't even know how they're going to tolerate stuff. But if I started introducing that 3 weeks ago at really low levels, I know exactly what they're capable of. I know exactly how they're going to respond to it. Obviously within the means of the protocol, the surgeon's protocol, or whatever, protocol that they're under, or, respecting bone stress injury type stuff. Those things you got to be careful of. You can't just like introduce a lot of dynamic activity really early just for the sake of it. I'm not saying that. So there's definitely context and injuries where this may not be quite as applicable, or if it is applicable, it's on a further away time point than early. But for a lot of, especially like soft tissue injuries and things like that, we can really start introducing this stuff very early in a rehab setting, probably a lot earlier than most people do, because they don't have this tiered system or idea of how to go about it.
All right, a few more questions before we wrap it up. One, and this may be again context dependent, but for that example, that athlete utilized, starting with the deep tier and the light tier, and then over time introducing ping, or doing, like you said, very intensive shuffling or very intensive backpedaling for a few rounds or a few sets, in regards to how you're implementing that practically during a session for an athlete, are you kind of characterizing the, let's say, the deep tier or the light tier as almost kind of preparatory work for a few hard intensive ping tier stuff? Or I think you mentioned it earlier on, where like the ping tier is kind of your top set, and then your back off sets, or maybe your medium or your deep tier. How are
Mm.
you structuring which one goes first, or is it just case dependent?
Yeah, it's a great question. So let's say, let's start with ideal situation. So perfectly healthy athlete, I would probably start with light tier stuff as more of a warm up into the ideas for the day, and it starts cueing into the language that we want to use. It sets the tone of like, what are we really working on today? What's the theme? And it helps them really like, kind of like start to cue into those things. So that light tier serves as something that is quick, it's dynamic, but it's not super high force, and it gets them prepped up for that, really quick reactive type thing, and helps us like start utilizing some language and cueing. Good. There's that. Then I would try to get to ping as soon as possible before energy starts becoming an issue or fatigue becomes an issue. So if we're warm and we're good, great. We're going to hit the top thing of the day. We're going to hit our top set. Let's get to it. We're warmed up. Let's get to our top set. Boom. You could use maybe like one medium tier exercise that looks extremely similar to the ping in preparation for your ping tier, and then come back to your medium stuff, more after you hit the ping. That's an option too, for a perfectly healthy person. And then, so after the ping, we would go medium, and then we're finishing off with the deep tier, more compliant strategy, more muscular strategy, because that's going to be a little bit more energy system and metabolically fatiguing on the back end. If I'm working with injured person that is dealing with a lot of pain, or we have a lot of restrictions that we got to be mindful of, that may totally change. I may go light and deep, and that's it. That's it for the day. Like, we're not getting any more than light and deep. So I'm going to start with light, end with deep, done. Even for some people, they may like tendon related stuff, like if they're dealing with some tendon pain, starting with deep actually may be a better strategy. You can start with the deep tier stuff to get them more compliant and just get the tendon warm and help them like not be so stiff and rigid. And then we're going from the deep tier backwards into the light, and then maybe hitting a few medium and seeing how they react and respond the following day or the following 48 hours, and then kind of, rerun it from there. But starting with the deep can be very helpful in a tendon related case. Now, if we're dealing with like surgical management type stuff, I may just go straight through because I don't know how they're going to respond. So I'm not going to go from light to ping because I don't know how they even tolerate medium yet. So I may go light, and then I'm going to go a little bit harder. There's a couple of things I got in my back pocket that I kind of want to see if we can tolerate. If that's all, like, dang, that was way cleaner, way better tolerated than I thought it would. Great. Now we can go on to ping. But if I jumped straight to ping, it may have been too much too soon, or they hadn't learned the coordinative strategies. So even from a learning perspective, and the learning technique type thing, I think going from light, medium, ping, and then putting tier, the metabolically stressful stuff on the back end, can sometimes be helpful. You could even go in surgical case, you could go deep to light to medium to ping. So the organization of those tiers can certainly change based on the type of athlete you're working with, what you think they kind of need in order to get prepped. Sometimes younger, less coordinated, less experienced athletes will need more on the front end of things and save the harder stuff for the back end because it's going to take them that long to like really understand what you're trying to give them. That is another strategy or another consideration, that if I'm working with someone who's done this for a lot of years, who's a pro, or they're really comfortable with change of direction type stuff, they've done it a lot, I can get to some higher stuff a little sooner in my programming versus, somebody who's a little bit younger, I may not be able to get to that as soon. So hopefully that gives some context without getting like too complex. But I'm just saying that, like, again, going back to where we very first started, embrace some of this like chaos, embrace that it isn't this perfectly set, follow this framework, follow this system, and you'll be successful, this algorithm. It's not like that, right? You have a lot of moving parts and variables that are going to change how and when you do things in any kind of a rehabilitative setting based on who you have in front of you and what kind of injury they've got. But categorically placing certain things in your mind in these tiers and in this framework of where I'm starting from an intensity or complexity based thing, and helping them learn all along these, objectives based on the CMAS that we went over and the qualitative stuff, you can have a lot of freedom in how you set this up. And that's the beauty of change of direction and field and return to play stuff, is that, dude, like, it is creativity. Like, the world is your oyster. Like, you can really blow the top off this thing and do all kinds of fun stuff, which, I think that gives people a lot of fun experiences. It gives the athletes fun experiences, and it doesn't have to be this extremely rigid thing. But if you make it rigid and categorically rigid in how you're programming and how you think about where certain volumes go in, that will help for sure. But in practice, in the actual application, it doesn't have to be quite as rigid on the end product.
I think that's a good place to stop. I have many more questions, but this could turn into like a 3-hour podcast. We may have to do a part 2. And like you're alluding to, maybe when some future products come out, we can dive a little bit further as well, because this is so much for people to already try to digest and probably listen to multiple times. This was like a masterclass on change direction, Q. This was amazing. We'll call it there. We'll plug, obviously, your information, how people can contact you if they want to work with you, Matt McKenna Swanson's work, and then the CMAS and that group. I think that is more than enough for people to go from beyond this podcast. We'll call it there. Thanks again, Q.